In this section, we're going to consider the Essentials Profile Manager. So Profile Manager sits under the Help tab. If I click on Profile Manager, that will load. So Profile Manager enables you to create groups of settings or profiles for various jobs you carry out within Essentials in order to be able to reuse them over and over again. So for example, you can create a group of settings for copying items, copying lists, copying sites, and so on. And then when you go to carry out those jobs, they'll be there for you to use again. So the easiest way to show how this works is actually to work through a migration example and show how we can create a profile. And then we'll also go and look in the Profile Manager and create a profile there too. So if I expand out my demo tenant here into the finance site and double click on the confidential documents library and load the document that sits in there. If I right click and choose to copy that and go and paste it in another library, that will open up the migration wizard for items. So you see the first page of the wizard here shows the target, second page shows the metadata, third page here actually shows the profile, and that determines which settings are selected down at the bottom here. So let's create a new profile. The default one is selected. Let's create a new one and call it migrate 5 versions and click save. So if I change the setting down here to include versions and change it to include only the most recent 5 versions and click save, now when I choose that profile, that setting will be selected. So I'll show you here. If I go to default, it's including all versions, change to migrate 5 versions. It's now selected to only migrate 5 versions. So now if I choose to carry out this job, it will migrate 5 versions. So if I go back to the Profile Manager here and click Help, Profile Manager, copy items, you see we've got a new profile here created for migrate 5 versions. If I select that, it will choose the options I've selected. And from here, I can make further changes to this profile. So I could choose maybe to overwrite if file exists and click apply. And now the migrate 5 versions profile will overwrite if the file exists. Within this view as well, I can also create a new profile. So I could create a new profile and let's say migrate 10 versions in this case, just for consistency with the example. Click on save, and now I can change this now to migrate 10 versions. So I click down here to most recent versions and select 10 and click apply. Now that will select 10 versions when I choose that as part of a migration. So we've got the default, all versions, 5 versions, and then 10 versions. And that's how the Profile Manager works when configuring profiles for various migration jobs. And then they become selectable. I'll just show you again if I was to do the same migration job. Just tee this up, copy, and then paste. And again, go to the profile page. We now have 2 additional available profiles, migrate 5 versions, migrate 10 versions. So all selectable from there. In addition to setting profile settings for migration jobs, within Profile Manager you can also set default values for other jobs within the tool and also change settings that determine how the tool works. So let's look at some of those now. So if I click again on Help, Profile Manager, we can look at the settings here. So I expand this out slightly so it's easier to view. There we go. So far we've looked at creating profiles for copying items, and the process is very similar for copying lists, copying sites, copying permissions, and so on. From here we can also specify profiles for downloading content, also uploading and copying content. If I click on Google Options, these are the options for migrating data from Google Drive to OneDrive. So for example here, we can specify the document format that we want the documents to be in when they're imported. Similarly, on the box options, we can specify the options for migrating from Box to OneDrive and Dropbox to OneDrive. If I click on File Share Pre-Migration Analysis, we can specify the values we want for the profile setting when we carry out a file share analysis. So from here we could change perhaps the file size limitation, the file size at which it will be flagged in the report, from 50 to maybe 100 megabytes. Similarly, we have the options for a SharePoint migration analysis, so we can set and change the defaults for those. So when we trigger that analysis, these will be the default values. So global variables are where you can change settings that determine how the tool behaves, and I would suggest you not change these unless you're engaged with someone from MetaLogix and you're looking to perhaps optimize something. Our team will be able to tell you which values may be suitable to change. By default, these are set at what we feel to be the optimum value, but if for some reason they need to be changed, it's worth engaging MetaLogix to discuss this. Password Manager is a section where you can store passwords within the tool. Invalid characters are where we can determine what an invalid character will be replaced with when it's migrated. So for example, the ampersand here, this was a character that was invalid in certain versions of SharePoint. When you migrate a file from perhaps a file share that contains an ampersand, by default it's replaced with a hyphen, but you could change that to a different value here and then save that. Similarly with the invalid name ending strings, they appear in this list and they're currently replaced by default with a hyphen, but you can determine a different character to replace those with, or group of characters. Under memory management, you can determine how much memory is assigned to the tool. With regards to essentials, the more the better with regards to memory, but don't assign so much that there isn't enough for the operating system to work successfully. So I've got roughly 64 megabytes of RAM available. I've configured 4. So I click on this drop down, I can configure more and then choose save, and it will prompt me to restart before those changes are made to the tool. Under email notifications here, you can determine an email account that will be notified when an action has taken place. So certain actions, for example, like a backup, you can have an email notification when that takes place. And this is where you would set that up. Password encryption, you can specify a form of encryption for your passwords if you're using those. Static URL replacement, you can use this to replace static URLs. And under the administrator here, we can choose whether or not to use a graph API when we're carrying out administration reports. So those are the settings within Profile Manager. As noted, we can use it to create profiles for migration jobs, specify default settings, and also specify more advanced settings within the tool, such as global variables.